All right, Ben.
All right, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending where you are. So welcome to this conversation. My name is Ben Daly. I'm the Chief Academic Officer at High Tech High. And this is in a way, an inaugural event for us. We have been a number of the Hewlett Foundation's grantees who are working on spreading more deeper learning to more students more often. We've been trying a lot of different stuff of how do you do that? How do you actually spread a complicated idea or a complicated set of outcomes like deeper learning? And so the idea of spread in general, and maybe diffusion of innovation as one lens, although not the only way that we think about that. I think also the improvement science work is another lens that a way we've been thinking about this. Which is the broad idea is we think this idea of deeper learning, which is about critical thinking, communicating, kids collaborating well with others, core academic content, and sort of learning how to learn, student agency. There's a smorgasbord of terms that we've been playing with for the last couple of deeper learning outcomes. That's what we want to see more of for more kids, and then how do we do it? And so a number of us have, we have a national conference. We've been opening more schools. We have Hack Your School workshops. So all of these different folks have been trying different things. And so we're really pleased and honored, honestly, to have two folks with us today who know a lot about the ideas of spread and scale and have success doing so in different domains. And so thank you so much to the both of you for joining us. And we're going to have a fairly informal conversation today, just kind of hopefully learning from both of them and thinking about, even if it doesn't exactly always apply to us, what are the lessons that we have? And so my colleague, Craig Wacker, is going to take it from here.
Great, thanks, Ben. So we're joined today by Joe McCannon of the Billions Institute and Cynthia Coburn of Northwestern University. And both of these folks have done some very, very interesting work in notions of kind of innovation spread and improvement, and the way, to Ben's comments, that these things intersect. We're early in this exploration of diffusion. We're early in this exploration of improvement. I think what we're looking for in this conversation are insights that are sort of just adjacent or outside of kind of the education sector perspectives that have animated our work today. And so we're hoping we can get a little almost like creative friction by seeing kind of how other sectors have taken on some of these issues and raise some themes that will be things that we want to explore further going forward. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. First to Joe. If you could tell us a little bit about how you come to this work, how it kind of animates the day-to-day work you do with the Billions Institute, and where maybe you're going, kind of taking these issues forward, that'd be great as grist for the conversation, and then we'll turn it over to Cynthia for an intro as well. Thanks.
Well, that sounds great. Thank you, Craig, and thank you all for having me here with you today. I'm delighted to join the group, in part because I love this subject matter so much, and I'm always willing to talk about it for as long as people would like to. And in part because I'm really taken by the work that you're all doing. I've familiarized myself some now with deeper learning and with the approaches that many of you are taking. And it's important work with really, really meaningful potential outcomes. And so to the degree that I could help even just a little bit here, I feel great about that. So my story when it comes to working on spread and scale starts in about the year 2000 when I was invited to join something called the 3x5 Initiative, which was an initiative of the World Health Organization to try to get 3 million people onto antiretroviral therapy for HIV and AIDS globally at that time. This was the time when people were just realizing how serious the HIV and AIDS epidemic was. They were beginning to understand the burden of disease, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And there were about 40 million people with the disease at that time globally. Only about 400,000 were on treatment, and the treatment need was about 6 million. So we had to figure out how do we get from 400,000 on treatment to 6 million on treatment in very short order. And we wanted to get to at least half, to 3 million, by the end of the year 2005. And that was my first kind of my founding experience, my seminal experience with this question of how do you take something that is known to work, that's deeply evidence-based, and see it get applied with high reliability in a variety of different settings where lots of different adaptations are required to make it work. And that began my journey in this work and made me, I sort of had an epiphany and realized this is the question that I'm interested in answering. I want to figure out how can we take what works, to everyone who can benefit from it as quickly as possible. I always like to think of the quotation from Doris Lessing, the great writer, from a book called Prisons We Choose to Live Inside. She said, I think when people look back at our time, they'll be amazed at one thing more than any other. It is this, that we do know so much more about ourselves now than people did in the past, and that so little of that knowledge has been put into effect. And that really is that's at the heart of what gets me up out of bed every morning, and the same is true for my partner, Becky Margiotta. That's what we care about and what we think about. At the end of that experience working on the 3x5 initiative, I then worked in healthcare again, domestically though, on the issue of patient safety. So the third leading cause of death in the United States is harm associated with healthcare. So infection, surgical complication, medication error. Estimates are that anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 people a year die due to unnecessary complications from their care. So I directed something called the 100,000 Lives campaign, which got 4,000 of the 5,000 hospitals across the U.S. to work on reducing harm to patients and to avoid 100,000 unnecessary deaths over an 18-month period. And that led me to yet another experience. I started to work outside of healthcare, working on something called the 100,000 Homes campaign, which totally different subject matter area, but sought to house 100,000 chronically homeless people. And that's where I met my partner, Becky. And both of those initiatives actually ultimately succeeded in meeting their objectives. And that the 100,000 Homes campaign got people from 186 communities across the country to introduce this intervention for housing people who were chronically homeless, as opposed to sheltering them or just putting them in healthcare, actually giving them permanent supportive housing that they would stay in. And then after that, I worked in the Obama administration for 3 years on rolling out the new models of healthcare in Obamacare, and was at the Gates Foundation for a couple of years, working again on spreading effective models of healthcare. So I'm just kind of running through my CV just to give you a flavor for the kinds of projects I've worked on, but the through line is, how do we take what's worked in one setting and adapt it to a lot of other settings very, very quickly? There are kind of 4 core elements that I think about in answering that question, and I'm not going to talk about them here now because this is when I would really go down a rabbit hole, but just want to say that the general philosophy that I take to this work is that the question we're trying to answer in figuring out how to take what works to everyone who could benefit from it is not how do we sort of get people to do something, how do we cajole them and push them and manipulate them and trick them into getting the thing done that we want these dummies to do. It's instead asking the question, how can we support them in getting done what they dream of doing, what their biggest dreams are, what they're most excited about? And that might seem like a subtle difference, but actually what that unleashes by asking that slightly different question, I find is extremely powerful. And so I'll stop there and say that's kind of what I think about when I think about how we get into this question of large-scale change. So I'll stop there and turn to Cynthia, but looking forward to really rolling up our sleeves on anything on this topic that interests you.
Great. Thanks, Joe. And Cynthia, you did some early influential work kind of in the nature of scale in the education sector, and I think you have a book coming out, it sounds like, later this year on that topic or a related topic, really kind of delving into the nature of reforms, kind of unpacking what reforms really are, both in a pedagogical but sort of a social context. I'm probably using the wrong language, but if you could say a little bit more about your scholarly focus on sort of scale, if you would still use the same term, that would be great.
Great. So I'm a professor at Northwestern University, and I have studied issues of spread and scale since 2002. So an important distinction is I haven't scaled anything up, but I've studied many different attempts to increase more and more kids being involved in different kinds of instructional reform in different kinds of setting. And what Craig just asked me was, do I use the term scale? In my work, one of the things that I've tried to do is distinguish between spread and scale. I see spread as the process of moving a variety of different things, whether they be ideas or tools or programs or practices, to more and more locations, more and more people, and scale being sort of the outcome of that spread. And I find that distinction to be helpful because people use the term scale in many, many different ways, from scaling up, which is sort of the equivalent of my notion of spread, to the scale of an intervention, from something very small to something very large. So there's just there's a lot of confusion, or same words used different ways, and that's the way that I've parsed those words out, and that's helped me sort of pull apart the process from the outcome and look at research from a range of different disciplines that speak to both of those things.
Great, thank you. So I think for our conversation today, since we really only have two discussants, we'd like to go with an informal setup, and hopefully one that could be a little bit more conversational. I don't feel the need to go to James Lipton on kind of interrogating our discussants today. So instead, I think what we would do is maybe start off with some examples. Joe, you mentioned the health sector, and obviously we know there's been a lot of improvement work in the health sector. There's also massive scale in this health sector about interventions. Can you provide an example, and it doesn't need to be an example that was successful, but it can be an idea that's either spread very well by nature of the characteristics of the innovation itself, or even the social contours of why it would spread, or even maybe an idea that hasn't spread well, and talk a little bit about why. It's your choice. Just an example, I think, to kind of animate the conversation.
Sure, yeah, glad to do that. And I'll tell you that it's always been a fantasy of mine to get the James Lipton, the Bernard Pivot question he asks at the end of the interview. So I'm ready for that. If you ever want to give it to me, yeah, I'm geared up. Yeah, why don't I do this? I will share with you two interventions, two practices that we tried to spread in the 100,000 Lives campaign. This was the initiative that I mentioned where we were working with hospitals on this massive problem, third leading cause of death in the country, and we said to these hospitals, all right, we've got to find a way into this problem, to this issue of people dying unnecessarily due to medication error or surgical complication or infection, or there are all these reasons why people are dying unnecessarily. So we gave them what we felt were 6 simple practices that they could take, just simple distilled things, ways to get started, to actually start to change in the hospital setting. What we didn't do is we didn't sort of give them a big systems change approach to thinking about patient safety across the whole organization, and it has to do with kind of a philosophy of change, which is that you have to start someplace, and that people just can't comprehensively introduce a whole new big strategy in one move. So you've got to sort of start with specific practices or interventions. And we did some good hard work. Our background at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, the organization that launched this, was in quality improvement. And so now in my current work, I apply networking science and diffusion science and a lot of statistics and logistics. But the mainstay science that we had at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement is quality improvement. And quality improvement asks you to, really think hard about the intervention or the practice you're introducing and constantly refine it through rapid cycles of testing. So this was not like we had just pulled these interventions out of the peer-reviewed literature. We had done a lot of testing. But even having done that, of these 6 practices that we sought to introduce in hospitals, there were a few that just took off absolutely like wildfire, and a few that did not. And and let me sort of explain the differences between them. So a practice that took off like wildfire was something called the rapid response team. The rapid response team is when someone is, before someone has a code event, before you hear the alarms go off in the hospitals and everyone rushes to them because of a catastrophic cardiac or respiratory event, there are signs that people give off. There are little clues in their vital signs that tell you that they're trending in the wrong direction. And so you can respond earlier with what's called a rapid response team to those symptoms and avoid those catastrophic cardiac or respiratory events, those code events. And so that intervention was wildly successful. It basically said, here are the 4 things you look for. Here's the composition of the team you put in place on each floor. And this is what it means to patients and families. And it basically, in a very compelling way, we were able to tell the story of lives saved and tens of years added to lives because people simply we preemptively identified the ways in which they were about to code and were able to intervene before they died. So that was something where very straightforward, streamlined, simple, emotionally compelling. People were really drawn to it. Not too difficult to introduce, didn't require new resources. A little bit controversial in terms of the evidence, but not so much so that people didn't do it. So that one succeeded. By contrast, we had a practice which has to do with medication reconciliation. And medication reconciliation basically means you come to the hospital with a list of medications. Do you leave with an updated list of medications that takes into account the medications you were on before? Because a major source of harm, and if you've had an older person in your family who's been in the hospital, you've experienced this, they come in with one medication list, they leave with another medication list, and they have different amounts and different doses and different names. You have generic drugs and non-generic drugs. It's totally confusing and overwhelming and often deadly. That process, which crossed many different settings, from the emergency department to inpatient care to discharge, that process had so many different disparate players in it that it was very, very problematic. And it was very hard for people to see, okay, come on, people will figure out their medications. People are smart, they'll figure this out. It was very hard for people to see why this was important or why it was meaningful. And it was a painstaking process if you think of having to reconcile that at every phase of the care process, from the time someone walks through the door of the hospital until the time that they leave, with every clinician that they interact with. It becomes overwhelming. It's too much. And so what we found was that, of the people who tried to do medication reconciliation, maybe 10% succeeded. Of the people who introduced rapid response teams, we had 80 or 90% success, and all of the stories of success that they were telling were about that specific intervention. So it has to do with these classic considerations that Everett Rogers raises, right, in Diffusion of Innovations. The nature of the intervention, how charismatic is it, how testable is it, how trialable is it, the nature of the audience, who's going to actually own this and take responsibility for it, how skilled are they, how interested are they, how committed are they, and then the method that we use to actually spread it. And I think in the case of the rapid response team, that methodology was simpler because we were in one care setting as opposed to crossing multiple care settings and having to orchestrate people across a more complex network. So that's an example that comes to mind for me. You're working in the same hospitals but struggling with different interventions.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges here, right, is to almost kind of impose a sense of elegance or simplicity on very dynamic situations, and I think that that's a bit of a crosswalk to Cynthia's work, in the sense that if you look at educational reforms, right, they can be pretty complicated and kind of dynamic things. And so, Cynthia, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about an idea in education you think is spread well, and maybe if you could kind of pull it apart a little bit in the context of some of the terminology and some of the lenses you use in your work.
Sure, I'm happy to. Can you hear me? It looks like I'm frozen. You guys hear me?
We hear you, but I don't see you.
Yeah, you'll just have to
blinding light that's behind my head, but I suspect it's probably something wrong with your camera.
Yeah, it just.
No, it's probably just the internet. Just keep going. I think it'll probably.
Okay, I can.
High-speed internet did not spread to your community, Cynthia. You must be still doing dial-up.
Apparently, technology's letting me down. Yeah. So one of the things when I was listening to Joe talk, one of the things that struck me about the two examples that he uses is that they're both interlocking social practices. They involve multiple people doing something different. And one of the things that I've learned in my research is that the qualities, the nature and the nature of spread and the qualities that promote spread differ a little bit depending on what it is that you're trying to spread. So ideas, if what you're trying to spread is an idea, that spreads differently than if you're trying to spread a tool, like in education, a curriculum unit or an assessment. Those things spread differently than practices, which is, I think, the examples that Joe provided for us are both, again, social practices that involved routines. And that's different than more complex programs. In education, I think about, comprehensive school reform or things like Success for All or, bigger sort of practices that spread that have multiple multiple components to them. And I was sort of thinking about deeper learning, and I think of deeper learning, and I think you do as well, as a set of ideas that sometimes have practices associated with them and tools associated with them, but at root it's a set of ideas. And so in terms of an example, I tried to think of examples where ideas spread widely. And I drew on a very good book by Jack Schneider. This is not my own work, this is his work. He has a book, it's called From Ivory Tower to the Schoolhouse, and he traces the spread of some very key important ideas in the education world that have really become ubiquitous, and he tries to understand why those ideas spread and others don't. And the example that I'll draw on is Bloom's taxonomy, which I think probably everybody here has got to have heard and know. And what's pretty interesting about Bloom's taxonomy is that it was actually developed for a very different reason. It was developed to aid test developers, assessment developers. But as an idea, pretty early on, it got taken up by curriculum developers, professional development providers, and teacher education programs. And this is over a period of decades, so we're not talking about the kind of rapid stuff that, that Joe very impressively was talking about. But these ideas, one of the reasons that these things spread was that it became bound into concrete representations in the forms of curricula and professional development, concrete tools and representations of practice. They also spread because, very similar to what Joe was talking about, these were ideas that were fairly simple. Most of us can probably list the 6 categories on Bloom's taxonomy. It's a fairly simple, elegant list. It also spread because it appealed to multiple constituencies. There were multiple people who had different sets of values about education that were able to connect those values to this idea. So early in the history of the spread, it appealed to progressives because of the link to critical thinking and higher order. It also appealed to traditionalists because of the focus on basic skills, but also because it appeared to be a hierarchy, a stepwise hierarchy, which connected with their understandings of student learning. That's actually not at all what the developers wanted meant by Bloom's taxonomy, but that's how people understood it, and that fostered widespread spread. And then the last criteria was that it met a felt need, which is also something that Joe talked about. There was not a lot of ways to categorize student learning, not a lot of ways to organize curricula at the time, and so people really grasped it as responding to it. But the same thing that happened to Bloom's taxonomy is something that happens with lots of spread of ideas, which is the same things that enable them to spread, their simplicity, their connection to multiple points of view, response to felt need, etc., are also the things that enable the meaning to become more diffuse, to move very far from original sets of ideas, and also sometimes even contradictory. And you can probably think of lots of things in the education sphere that are like this. Multiple intelligences is another. Constructivism is another. There's a lot of ideas that, as they have spread, no longer come to mean the same thing as when they started. And that is absolutely the case with Bloom's taxonomy and some of these other ideas. Something, I can talk more about what helps ideas hold their integrity as they spread widely, but something, just a sort of a quick sort of piece to that from the Bloom's taxonomy example is that ideas tend to hold their integrity a little bit better when they're built into concrete representations, when they're built into tools, when they're built into representations of what it means for practices to change. What's the contrast between this set of ideas and existing set of ideas? When these ideas require people to do things that's fairly different from what it is they already do, provide ideas that are accompanied by capacity building that enable people to do things in different ways. One of the things I forgot to say was one of the nice things about Bloom's taxonomy was it didn't ask people to do much different. right? It created a framework for organizing what it was they were already doing, and therefore it spread really, really widely, but didn't necessarily promote changes in approaches to instruction.
Great. Thank you for that very specific example. I mean, I guess one direction to pivot in now is to think about, and I think, Joe, you did this with your example, instances where there's been sort of an intentional focus on spread, right? An intentional focus on scale on both sides of that, as you represented, Cynthia. And to think about how a network, an organization, an entity was intentional about that. And there are obviously multiple dynamics there that you could think about: formatting kind of ideas, mapping networks, that kind of thing. But I'm going to start a little bit more kind of immediately with the practitioner perspective and turn it to you, Joe, with a question about how do you introduce some of these big ideas, right? But do it in a way that it's going to get accepted and embraced and adapted by line practitioners. How do you think about that, and can you give some examples of that?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. So philosophically, it comes back to this idea that I mentioned in passing earlier, which is that unless you are in an autocratic system where you have total executive authority over all the players in the system and can just simply tell them what to do, it's very hard to sort of force a practice or force an idea or a concept down people's throats. And actually, even in instances where you have a lot of executive authority, so I worked at Medicare and Medicaid when I was in the government, and by far the dominant force in American healthcare is Medicare and Medicaid. It holds all the purse strings. We could tell people what to do, but that didn't really mean people were going to change practices. It might mean that they'd sort of genuflect and say, okay, this is the new important thing from CMS, this is the new concept, the triple aim or deeper learning or whatever your concept of the month is. But even in a system like that, you really don't get people to buy into something until they experience it as, if not their own idea, an expression of something that they deeply believe in and want to actually embrace and make happen. So the kind of the cognitive experience is one where someone comes in and says, all right, well, here's a new idea, and what you want the receiver to be doing is to say, yeah, that reminds me of this, and I've been wanting to solve this problem, and that's really cool. And in that case, you don't say to them, well, but you're not exactly hewing exactly to my standard and exactly what I believe. You say, fantastic. Oh, I love what you've got there. You take that and you run with it, because you're really on to something that's special or exciting. So it's almost like a classic community organizing approach. I want to deeply listen one-on-one to what means the most to you. I want to find out where that overlaps with what I believe, what we have in common, and then I want to come to some agreement on what we're going to implement or what we're going to get done together now. So it's sort of that Marshall-Gansian type framework. That's sort of the philosophical part. The practical part, when it comes to how you actually implement the practice, I think just has to do with, so you've gotten people bought in, they're emotionally on board, they buy in. What now? What do I do next? And that's when I think about what Huggy Rao from Stanford calls the ergonomics of the innovation. And he actually wrote an article about this in reference to the work that we did in the 100,000 Lives campaign in the McKinsey Quarterly. Basically, what Huggy said is that there's so much that people are doing on a daily basis. They're inundated with requests and information and things that they need to do. They're so stuck in their business as usual kind of inertia patterns and ways of doing things that the best thing we can do is give them something that's really simple and really straightforward that they can try tomorrow, so that's the trialability thing, and that they can see the results of very, very quickly and begin to build their confidence and their optimism as they go. That's when I'm thinking of spread, when I'm managing these large-scale change initiatives, it might sound weird, but what I'm managing to is the confidence and the optimism of everyone who's taking part. How can I stoke their confidence and their optimism that change is actually possible? And that the design of the intervention can actually be very closely related to that.
So thank you. Turning to you, Cynthia, and maybe with a question that's a little bit more focused on the education sector and some of the challenges of spread in education. Can you talk a little bit about the context for adoption, especially, let's say, by a teacher of an idea, even when you get things that are elegant, simple, that are adaptable in ways that promote ownership, let's say? Kind of the degrees of freedom in a lot of education environments can be pretty limited. What are we sort of facing in the context of the education sector, and what are some of the implications for actually, more actively diffusing an idea like a deeper learning concept or a practice?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this when I was listening to Joe's conversation, because part of, I think, what Joe was pointing to was the way in which an idea or a tool or a practice needs to enter into pre-existing work practices. That one of the things that appears to spread things is that it's something that can be incorporated into the way that people do their work, and perhaps use that thing as a leverage as a lever to shift their work over time. And so what that does, acknowledging that, turns us back to the nature of schools, the nature of classrooms, the nature of, in conventional school districts, because one of the challenges is that you can have individuals within schools who are very enthusiastic, who really want to do this work, but there's things about the nature of their work and the nature of their workplace that make it very hard for them to bring things into their existing practices. There's the complexity of the classroom. Changing one little thing often has a lot of ripple effects that fan out and can create difficulties in other aspects of the work. And the real classic sort of example of that is, when people tried to implement constructivist approaches to teaching and learning, that created a lot of issues around behavior management, around noise concerns, around school leaders who didn't understand what teachers were doing, etc. So that's sort of one piece. But the other issue is most teachers are responding to many, many pressures and priorities. And those pressures and priorities in the broader system, whether that be schools or school districts or charter management organizations or state policy, sometimes tend to hold things in place in ways that are very, you can't make this movement because you've got to do this thing because that's the priority of the principal or that's the priority of the school district. The other issue that comes from that is also, a lot of schools are basically pretty terrible places for adults to learn. New approaches, new practices, new tools require people to learn things typically. And when you're with kids for your entire workday and then you have tons of work that you're doing off the clock, they're not opportunities for you to reflect, try something out, reflect, make adjustments. There's often people have been working really hard to develop things like professional learning communities as a way to provide opportunities for people to talk more, to do these kinds of reflection, to try things out, to learn from one another. But a lot of PLCs are very focused on other people's agendas or on sort of accountability things, compliance sorts of things. And often there aren't very substantive, learningful kinds of conversations in those PLCs. So I guess the main takeaway is not one of gloom and doom, but I think that especially as the thing that you're trying to spread becomes more complicated, as it departs further from existing practice, as it requires more to learn how to do it. It's important not to simply think about the thing, but also think about the context within which the thing that you're trying to spread is coming, and think about ways of addressing the contextual things that are the aspects of the context that may get in the way of people incorporating things into their practice.
Great, thank you.
Craig,
yeah, please.
I just wanted to pick up on something there. It's a really important point, I think. I think if you look at the Rogers framework, which is terrific, seminal, wonderful. So this is not to nitpick the Rogers framework, but what the Rogers framework says is tell me your intervention, tell me the composition of your audience, and then from that sort of think about what our best method for spreading is going to be. What that misses, and what it's always missed for me as a practitioner, is where are we in history? What moment in time are we actually in right now? Are we at a time when the new administration is interested in the thing we're doing? Are we at a time when our knowledge is really advanced and we've got great prototypes and pilots that are totally bulletproof? Are we at a time when we've got regulation and we've got law in place and we're actually shifting into kind of meme change and culture change and mind change? But that dictates so much about what we need to be doing and kind of what our work is. So if we're telling a 10-chapter story, I always say this to the people we work with, what chapter are you on? Are you in chapter 2? Are you in chapter 8? Because this stuff, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the real world. So I could go. There's an example of that we use in our work about kindergarten and how the idea of kindergarten developed from the 1840s. With Friedrich Vogel in Germany, all the way to 1986 when it was finally made a state law in Mississippi, compulsory kindergarten, the way that thing unfolded, first of all, you could never predict it. I mean, you have to be totally opportunistic and just kind of ride the wave as a change like that unfolds. But also, you just have to, know what's appropriate at a given moment in time. So you wouldn't have been wanting to think about policy change in 1840. You needed to do 20 or 30 years of work on prototyping and piloting. Equally, you didn't need to keep doing prototyping and piloting at the same level of intensity in 1975. So it seems like an obvious point, and yet sometimes I think we design too much in a vacuum and don't appreciate that context in the way that Cynthia is underlining.
Yeah, that's great context. Go ahead, sorry.
Let me just piggyback just one more thing on what Joe said is your example of kindergarten made me think. So context is not just a barrier; it also enables, right? And in any context there are things that create opportunities for spread. The way to which, to the extent that people who are trying to spread something are able to connect them to that context. So I think I was reading reading more about deeper learning on your website, and a really good example of that is the ways in which you all are trying to link deeper learning to the Common Core. And in some cases, I imagine that is an enabler. It depends on what state you're talking about, the degree to which that then becomes a problem. But that's a really good example because policy, it creates opportunities in a couple ways. It creates funding opportunities that things can get connected to, but it creates rhetorical opportunities. This idea as a way to meet the demands of, in this case, Common Core. When NGSS, National Next Generation Science Standards, was really up and coming, I was doing some work on with a lot of science. People who are trying to foster science, and all of a sudden they kind of cued into that and started talking about their approach in terms of next generation science standards. And I know in Chicago, where a lot of this work was being done, that helped people on the ground see this as a way to solve their problem, being, oh my God, we have these new sets of standards and we don't have the tools, we don't have the curricular approaches anywhere near it to meet it. And so that's a way in which some very strategic folks were able to leverage context as a way of providing support for their work. The big, in the first Obama administration, there was a big emphasis on after school. And many people were able to connect their extended learning kinds of approaches to these policy movements at the federal government. And we often think about the federal government as being so very, very, very far from classrooms. But in this case, these kinds of big policy initiatives, and it's the same when you go down the chain, provide opportunities as well as constraints.
So Really, really interesting back and forth there. And I think this point about sort of these contextual aspects, historical almost, but also specific to movements and policy, providing a form of like tailwind for the adoption of certain things and of ideas is a really important thing to think about. In sort of in a micro sense, I'm wondering if improvement is an idea which has just been, it's finding its footing in the education sector, I think now. Is it an innovation that to some extent has affordances through practitioner empowerment, through kind of the opportunity to adapt, through allowing local kind of jurisdictions and teams to surface their own ideas and iterate on them, while still kind of hewing to kind of systemic and or kind of macro level concerns? Is improvement sort of a way into some of these spread questions that looks like it's an opportunity? And if so, how do we think about that? How do we think about it generally, and how do we think about it in the context of deeper learning? Joe, I'm going to turn to you just initially, since I think you have so much depth of experience in the improvement space, just to kind of reflect on that.
Yeah, I think the zen of improvement is that on one hand you have a practice or a set of ideas or a set of concepts that you believe are worthwhile, that have been prototyped and piloted, and you have a high degree of confidence in them, and yet you know that the way that it looks in one instance is always going to be different in another instance. So what improvement does is improvement acknowledges the fact that this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum, it happens in the real world, and so the science of improvement is basically the science of adaptation. That's the key action that you're taking if you're an effective improver, is you're figuring out, how do I take an idea or a promising concept and make it work in my setting, for my team, with the people that we serve. And so that's all improvement is getting you to do, really. It's sort of, if you think of the model for improvement or lean or PDSA or any of these concepts, really that's all just, those are like mnemonic devices or tools for remembering that you've got to figure out how to take something that's a concept and actually bring it to ground and make it work in practice. And the only way you do that is through iteration. And we know that through our experience as human beings. The only way that I learned to drive a car, I wasn't reading a book about driving a car. It was, I spent weekends in the car driving around with my dad and figuring out, how do I adjust the seat to fit my body, and where do I like my mirrors to be, and how do I go and drive on dirt roads versus regular roads, and standard versus, so all of that adaptation is the kind of the fun and the joy, I think, of improvement. And so when we think of scaling or we think of spread, what we're really doing is we're scaling the capacity of people all across our network to make that adaptation. Sure, you're spreading a specific practice. Okay, that's sort of the Trojan horse. But what you're really spreading is the ability of people out at the periphery, in classrooms and in schools and in districts, to make adaptation of knowledge themselves. As a little bit of an aside here, I can hear what I'm saying, and this sounds like deeper learning. This sounds like SEL. In effect, these are the skill sets that you're trying to transmit to students in the best cases, and it's an improvement in adaptation skill set. It's how do I take knowledge and apply it in the real world.
Great, thank you. Cynthia, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of improvement, or maybe whatever term you would use, and how that dynamic kind of unfolds in the context of spread?
Yeah, I think I just want to make 2 points. The first is I want to correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, but when I listen to you talk about improvement science, and when I've listened to other people talk about this issue, one of the things that I think is really interesting about it is that yes, there is this practice, but it's also a set of tools to support people in this adaptation. And in that sense, the innovation, so to speak, is one that is also kind of intervening in context, in the context. So it's building capacities in a local context or contexts, given the networks that are involved, to in the short term, implement a given practice, but also create different kinds of environments for future change efforts. So in that sense, rather than context being static, it's a set of strategies for trying to create a context or adapt a context such that it's a more fertile environment for making these kinds of changes by developing a set of practices, etc. So that's one point that I want to make. The second point that I want to make about improvement science is that this notion of scale as adaptation, I think, is a really important notion. It is not the way that people in education tend to think of scale, and it's also not typical practices for people in education. So, for example, many people try things once. And especially if something's sort of complicated, of course it's not going to work once. And there's not structures to help people try something again in a slightly different way, or to sort of diagnose why isn't something working. So it's the kinds of practices that Joe are talking about are really quite counter-normative within education. And so something to really think hard about is how to seed those kinds of practices in education. That's a challenge in and of itself. Because it is quite counter-normative. But the second element that's counter-normative is this notion of adaptation. In the public speak right now, and in federal policy and other kinds of places, the notion of scale has been very tightly linked to the notion of replication, implementing things with fidelity. And there's sometimes different notions about what are the bounds of that fidelity, what are acceptable adaptations, what are not acceptable adaptations. But that's, I guess, one of the messages that I want to get across is that's one way to conceptualize scale, but there are other ways of conceptualizing scale. Adaptation is another way of conceptualizing scale, and most people who think about adaptation think about it it's not anything goes. It's adaptations in ways that are true to underlying principles. And in order for that conception of scale to sort of be a functional one, I think, you have to have pretty clear ideas about what those underlying principles are and ways of measuring it. Ways of sort of assessing, is this adaptation meeting the ultimate outcomes that we care about? And creating sort of a feedback loop to inform further elements of adaptation. Good.
Oh, sorry, Cynthia. I just had another thought, but go ahead.
Well, I was just going to throw right out there. I think there's at least two other conceptualizations of scale that we could talk about. One is just adoption. So are more and more people participating in something? Are more and more people buying into deeper learning? Are more and more people doing, using this curricula? People who care about adoption, the numbers are the main goal. How people use those ideas are maybe less of a concern. And I used to be kind of snotty about adoption, thinking it was not a very valued way to go in terms of scaling things up, but I've come to understand that it may be part of a broader process, because one of the things about the spread of ideas is that the more people who are doing something, the more ideas spread. There's a network effect. So creating bigger adoption may be one vehicle for creating fertile environments for going deeper. So that's one way to think about adoption in a functional sort of way, I think. And then the fourth way that we've identified of thinking about scale is reinvention. And that's the idea that you're putting out sets of ideas for lots of local, to garner or generate lots of local experimentation, lots of invention of new things using these ideas as sort of tools that get combined in particular ways. And that notion is pretty prevalent. It comes really, it's pretty prevalent for people who are trying to spread digital sorts of things because it really comes from the software world. and it represents an incursion of some of that ethos into the way we do things in education.
Great. Joe, were you going to weigh in?
Well, in part, I was going to say something similar to Cynthia, which is just that, you know, when, for this question around fidelity, you know, replication versus adaptation, a lot, again, depends on the intervention, and it depends on where we are in the process of scaling. A science that I think is understudied and really valuable and important, and the kind of the big thinkers here are people like Carl Weick, is the science of reliability. You know, reliability science is used in industries like the nuclear industry, or chemical processing, or the landing pads on aircraft carriers, where if you make one little mistake, people die. And so in that field, in that environment, what you want is the core process. The goal is that that thing happens 100% of the time, because we know that if that thing happens 100% of the time, people won't die. So there's a way you land a plane on an aircraft carrier. There's a way you process things in a nuclear facility to avoid a catastrophic event. So there are times when high reliability is actually what we're after. In Wales, there's a great study from the Neath Port Talbot School District in Wales, where they did a high reliability test where they just said, can we identify 5 or 6 core processes, core education processes that we know get good results, and can we introduce them in Neath and Port Talbot, which were among the poorest districts in Wales. And lo and behold, just by thinking about fidelity, by thinking about replication, they got major improvements, and they actually eclipsed the overall performance of the health system, having been a big laggard in advance. So there are times when thinking about high reliability and fidelity and replication is important, and other times when it's less so. The only little additional point I'd make is that even when you're worried about high fidelity or high reliability or exact replication, there's still a lot of creativity to that. So it's not like people are being asked to be automatons. They still have to make adaptations to make the highly reliable thing happen in their setting. So, you know, a Chinese aircraft carrier is going to have a different protocol than an American aircraft carrier. A nuclear power plant in France from 1960 is going to look very different than one in the United States from 1995, but you still want high reliability to happen in very similar ways. So, the truth here is, with anything having to do with spread and scale, and I relish this, which is one of the reasons I think I do this work, is it is super contextual, and you really can't. There is no sort of silver bullet answer. It all has to do with sort of where you are and what you're working on in a given process. It's about knowing the right questions to ask, not having the right answers in advance.
So just to surface a question that came up in the chat, and it's sort of it's kind of a reckless response to the point you just made, which is going back to the Rogers curve, right, of the difference, or the rhythm of adoption, if you will, right, starting with kind of the innovators and the early adopters. You know, I think what we face with a lot of innovations in the education space is you'll get uptake to a certain kind of degree across pretty robust networks, but the system is so big and to some extent fragmented, right, that getting broad adoption of ideas, and the ideas can be, you know, specific practices on up to, you know, school models, is not as broad as one might like, right, for ideas like deeper learning, or even kind of things that are very inherent like constructivism. I mean, I guess there are different ways of understanding adoption of that. But the question I would ask is, what are the specific either characteristics or filters for understanding that sort of passing of the baton from kind of the early adopters in the Rogers curve to kind of this broader adoption across systems? What are some of the things that really distinguish the ideas that kind of get percolating at the beginning of that curve, but then, you know, go system-wide? And, you know, I guess conversely, why do some ideas flame out, right? If you could talk a little bit about that, Joe, I'll put it to you first, kind of in the health sector, maybe an example of each quickly, that would be great. And just to note, we've got about 5 more minutes on the seminar, and it would be great after this question if you all could just think about some advice you might give us in our exploration, since we're very early in this, places we might turn, things that we might kind of structure as an experience for this community that we've assembled to study these issues. Just have that in your mind as you're taking on this question about the Rogers curve. Thanks.
Sure. Okay. So a lot to process there. So on the question about the Rogers curve and sort of how do you work the curve, you know, or sort of how do you manage it to spread an idea? I mean, one thing is that you have to, it's not an abstract concept, you know, you have to put names and people on that curve and think about who really are the people who, in the innovator and early adopter camp, who really matter the most. So when we launched that 100,000 Lives campaign, you know, in U.S. hospitals, we had on stage with us the American Medical Association, the American Nurses Association, Medicare, Medicaid, the Joint Commission, all of these people who sent a really strong message. We also had with us opinion leaders, the bloggers, the people who we know sort of lead the whispering campaigns. So there's a real kind of, again, I'm a practitioner, so you know this is maybe less than sexy, but there's just kind of this like trench work you have to do about saying, all right, these are the 30 people I got to get on board, and if I get these people on board, this thing is going to fall into place. The other thing is that, you know, there is kind of an organic quality to ideas that emerge around the same time, and so, you know, I'm new to education, but I keep coming across ideas which sound like deeper learning to me. Now, you would be able to tell me the ways in which they're not the same, that, you know, social and emotional learning is different from deeper learning, is different from all of these different approaches, but, you know, concepts sort of do bubble up at the same time, and so there is kind of this meta task of saying, hey, listen, we're roughly on the same page, so, you know, we might not be exactly in lockstep with one another, but let's not fight about that. Let's sort of, you know, be clear about the general direction of travel we're taking and embrace that. The last thing I'd say is, you know, the Rogers curve is just it's a natural distribution that describes any given population for any given intervention, and it's going to differ for different people for different interventions. So you can't always assume it's going to be the same people. You have to live out in the field and interact with the field to find where things are. You know, I like to spend a lot of time with laggards and traditionalists. I reject the notion that you only work with innovators and early adopters, because I think the laggards and traditionalists give you a lot of clues about what you have to do in your early work in order to sort of prepare the way for subsequent work. But what I've often found in interacting with those quote-unquote laggards is they're laggards on some things and they're total innovators on other things. And so you know, you have to sort of live out there in the field and engage with people. And maybe that's a final thought as a piece of advice, just to wrap up what you were asking for. You know, is that you can do great strategy and planning. You can think about design of a scalable intervention. You can think about design of a great learning network. But what sets apart the initiatives that succeed is how the work gets done day in and day out. What is the rhythm, the tempo, and the style of the team that actually gets out in the field and engages with the work. It's really messy, but if you get quick cycles of data in the spirit of quality improvement from all around the network, again, if you create these little laboratories all throughout your network and everyone is empowered to be a great improver, all of that information coming back to you, that's what makes the change happen. You know, how you adapt and adjust to that and spread tacit knowledge, just-in-time knowledge between people who are struggling with nitty-gritty problems at the front lines, that's the essence of this stuff. And so you can't spend too much time in contemplation or planning. You couldn't possibly permute all the things that are going to happen once you begin to engage with the real world.
Great, thank you so much. Cynthia, I don't know if did you get my incredibly long-winded question?
Yes.
Good.
we're close to the end though. So what I'll just do the quick 2-second piece of advice, which is that it's really important to attend to what it is that you're trying to spread. There are no generic strategies for spread and scale. It's really important to attend to what it is that you're trying to spread. It's really important to attend to the nature of the people and the context they live in ways that I think Joe's examples really animate. And it's also equally important to think about the capacities of the person or organization that's trying to do the spreading. There are different sets of strategies that are available to different kinds of people with different kinds of infrastructures. Infrastructure for supporting spread is really important. Things don't just magically happen. They require care and feeding. They require partnerships. They require linking up with networks. They require capacity building. All those things require resources. So people in different kinds of institutional homes with different kinds of resources will have to think very strategically about the different kinds of strategies that are available to them, given what they're trying to spread, the nature of the context, and what their ultimate goals are for scale.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to our speakers. I'm going to turn it over to Ben now to close us out. And again, thanks so much for a great conversation.
Okay, yeah, ditto on the thanks, and I just wanted to say to folks who are watching from afar or who are watching this later on recording, please give us some feedback on this. I think I personally would like to see us have more folks in the room next time. We're kind of all figuring out our process as we're doing this kind of work. We'll have to have more of these kind of sessions in the future. So please send feedback our way and carry on the good work, everybody. Thanks.
Bye-bye.